art and resistance is one of those themes that can so easily be flattened, made very unidimensional in the way we think of it, especially because of the environment we live in today. What I would try to do today is to try and maybe peel layers or attempt to peel layers on what resistance could mean, how does it manifest itself, and how it is shown and not seen in the way art is made. Even art, that word itself is quite fascinating. The moment I say art, I'm sure there are images in every one of your heads. You see something, you hear a poem, you hear a tune, you imagine of your favorite artist, something comes into your mind's eye when you say art. But there is always a struggle for an artist, or even for a connoisseur of art or an aficionado, of saying, if you ask the question, what is art? And then we are all slightly grappling with that whole word. Is anything that is attractive or appeals to me? Appealing can be of any sort. Art? Somebody argued with me once that the lines that the ants leave on sand after they walk is art. Is it art? So what do we mean when we use that word art? I think I just want to dwell a few minutes on that before we go to resistance, because then we may not know what we are talking about. I may not know what I'm talking about. I think it is important to understand art is a very conscious human endeavor. It's a conscious human endeavor created by human beings. I think that is very important to comprehend for us. It is not an accidental happening, and it is irrelevant whether you find it beautiful or not. That's the most interesting thing about art. Because then we are talking about what you find pretty, what I find pretty, your social context, my social context. No. Art is beyond these subjective perceptions of liking or disliking, loving or not. But it is a human endeavor. Human beings created art, or arts in plural. But why? My great teacher, Sammagudi Srinivasayar, used to say this, and I, of course, disagree with him. But he used to say, always remember, art is not a necessity. Food is a necessity, clothing is a necessity, home is a necessity. Remember, art is not a necessity. And I didn't think much of it when he said it, but later I realized how problematic that statement is. So if art is not a necessity, say I'm going to agree with Sammagudi Srinivasayar, then why have art? Why have poetry? Why imagine? Why dream? Because I think human beings realized that art does something different from, shall we say, many other activities we are involved in. But what does it do? Art is like this window. It opens a window to experience life in a manner that your normal condition doesn't allow you to experience. What is your normal condition? Your normal condition is about yourself. The normal condition of every human being here is based on yourself. Every observation, every thought, every action, you are the center of that entire operation. Or you are related very directly to every one of those things. But somehow, art allows you to escape that, even momentarily. That is when people will say, I went to a concert, or I heard, when they read a poem, they read a page, they almost feel they were not there. For a moment, they almost imagine as if they are the word. Or when they hear a beautiful tune, they use the word divine. It's a very interesting word that they use. And the reason they do this is momentarily, they're able to connect in a manner that doesn't keep them in the center of that connection. In other words, it abstracts a life experience which is not just a transactional happening of you getting something from it immediately, necessarily. So there are two parts, though, to art. There is the literal, which means there is actual writing, there is actual acting, there are human beings doing that, there is physical, there is a body there. The dancer is a body, the musician is a body, so it's physical. It's not mythical. It's not outer body. And then there is that abstractness where somehow the body kind of disappears. And there is this interaction between these two things that are always happening in art. So we have to understand this as a kind of mechanism of art. And then art has so many genres. It has painting. Music has so many kinds of music. There are so many kinds of writing. Prose is not poetry. Haiku is not Tirukkural. Tirukkural is not modern poetry. Are they all the same? Am I going to say every one of them are the same? No. But what I can say with a degree of confidence is that every one of these forms are looking at the literal and the abstract. And in that relationship between the two is where the form opens itself up. Through the voice, through the color, through the word, through movement, through theatrics, through all these ways. And that is what makes art so essential to living. I disagree with Shemmangudi Srinivas that art is an essentiality of society, which is why we say a society that has robust art is a society that is active, a society where ethical questions can be asked, simply because most ethical questions can be asked only when you're not the center of that question. If you are the center of the question, usually you flounder in ethics, because then you're talking about yourself. And art allows you to do that, to kind of escape our own conditionality. Then within this word, or shall I expanding this word, to some extent, we use the word culture. Again, a word, especially in today's context, baffles me. In fact, I don't even understand when we say Indian culture. That's just an outright lie. There is no Indian culture. There's probably Indian cultures. And it's probably true that each one of us know about 0.1% of what we are talking about. The culture you know is your context, your home, your environment, your college, your town, your exposure. That is your culture, your reading. So when we say Indian culture, I went to Nagaland a couple of years ago during COVID. I was there very, very far away in the jungle. And after spending a week, I actually thought to myself, is there anything that connects me to that person I am talking to culturally? And the answer is nothing. We connected as human beings, yes. But culturally, which means in terms of habits or in terms of even imagination, in terms of our association with nature, in terms of body, there was nothing that connected me to that person. I could have been in any other part of the world. So when we say Indian culture, what are we talking about? We are just lying through our teeth. We have just drawn one line and called it Indian culture. We have to be honest enough to navigate this. Only then we will be able to share anything with another person. So when we bring art, and somehow artists and art forms are supposed to be like the emblems of culture in some manner. So if you say, what is your culture? People point to three things: clothing, food, art. This is usually what people will do. If you say culture, what you eat, what you wear, and what are the songs you listen to or the dances you see. And so artists somehow by default become the flag bearers, torch bearers for culture. And unfortunately, I also became a torch bearer for a culture. Now, when we get there, it gets even more messier. Why? Because as much as I can say that art is abstracting human experience, art is situated, like I said, in the body, in the literal, in a context. So if an art form is, if I may say, trapped within a certain cultural sphere, the question emerges, can it really abstract? Am I falsifying this entire thing? a tough question to answer, which I hope I will address as we move on, because it's important to think about. Is it possible to abstract when your situation itself is purely trapped and conditional? Is it possible? Does it happen? Interesting. And the fluidity of culture and the fact that cultures rather, and the fact that past, present and future is very, very unsure in the way culture flows. Though we will say something is 200 years old or 500 years old, it flows in almost a manner where you don't know. You really don't know. If you ask me, for example, from my own music about some raga, I can probably tell you, yes, this raga is written about in this treatise. It has been sung in this manner. But the raga is not one being. It's not one element I'm pointing to. When I say a raga is written about in some treatise 200 years ago, the next question is the raga you're singing now the same as that raga written in that book? And the answer is no. So then, are there two ragas? What is it I'm connecting with that past? So what has flowed to me? Is there anything really flowing? Or am I imagining this entire thing because I want to find something in the past that validates my present? The one thing we should know about most scholars who wrote about the past, in most manuscripts that I've seen, especially culture-related manuscripts, is that they will connect themselves automatically to some great writer of the past. For example, Bharata. Everybody loves to talk about Bharata, who wrote the Natya Shastra. Now, Bharata, you can date it, give or take, 200 years before Common Era, 200 years after Common. That 400 years is the marker of when the Natya Shastra is supposed to be written. Okay, accept it. Now, how do I understand Bharata? By reading commentaries by Abhinavagupta. Now, when did Abhinavagupta write the commentary? 600 years later or 800 years later in 8th century. Now, you can ask a very important philosophical question, is what was Abhinava writing about? When he read Bharata, was he reading Bharata or himself? Was he reading his understanding of art that moment from reading Bharata? He was recontextualizing Bharata in his context. So when I, 2000 years later, go and read Abhinava, what am I reading? Yet I will say everything came from the Natya Shastra and raise my hand. This is just utter rubbish, very simply put. It's just utter rubbish. It's far more complex. Yes, those are beautiful documents. Those are important understandings. I don't think I'm denying any of that. But I'm saying there needs to be greater complexity when we look at these kind of cultural flows and ebbs and withdrawals too. Some things disappear too, please remember. In this now, we bring this word resistance. And when I use this word today, and as I use it now, and as I'm sure many of you are listening to it, you hear it as, if I may say just for a moment, as a political expression. I'm not saying art is not political. Before you jump at me at that, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying it suddenly jumps up as a very overtly political expression. It is. And our present environment or our own grapplings with democracy, grapplings with rights, with equality, with liberty, all get, shall we say, embedded in that one word, resistance, the moment I said it. The one thing we have to clearly remember about the word resistance is inherent in it is a pointer towards an imbalance in power. The reason you use that word is because you're saying that there is a power imbalance, that there is some form of homogeneity being forced or marginalization being forced. This has to be understood. I'm saying this forcefully today because in today's political environment, you have a majoritarian government, union government, you have a majoritarian cultural habit, a highly Brahminical cultural habit, which is now saying we never had space to express ourselves and almost positioning themselves as the ones who are resisting the rest of society. There can't be something more vulgar than this expression. This is not resistance. This is further oppression. This is further marginalization. Resistance is only when it comes from a position where the voice has either been shut out, muted, erased, doesn't find space. These kind of struggles is the basis of resistance. So when we speak about art or cultural resistance, we are looking at what you could say is an down to up pushback, a collective pushback of an oppressive structure. And the oppressive structure can be of various forms and types. So, but there are three elements to it. What is the resistance against? Who is resisting? And why is there resistance? I'll start with the second point. Who is resisting? That goes back to community, people, thoughts, even ideas. That could flow beyond one community. That could go across social spectrum, are sometimes completely pushed to the side. So it could be ideas that are being pushed back on. It could be communities. It could be ethnicities. It could be many kinds of people who are protesting or who are resisting through art and culture. What are they resisting? And here it can get a little more nuanced. And I will come back to it as I give you a few examples of it. Why? In most societies in the world, the condition of the most oppressed especially, whether it is oppressed because of caste, race, color, gender, sexual preference or anything, they are in a perpetual state of cultural resistance. They are in a perpetual state of cultural resistance because there is no other way the rest of society is even paying attention. So they always have to come and tell you, listen to our voice, listen to what we have to say. We will not accept what you're saying. And that brings great art, but it's also a reflection of how the rest of us behave in society. That a group of people have to constantly be telling us on our face that their existence is at jeopardy because of who we are or how we behave. So, is resistance then an inherent quality about art? It's an important question. Is inherently art always resisting something? Now, I don't think that is a necessity. Art could be asking questions, yes. But does it transform itself to a resistive mode? I am not entirely convinced that it is a necessity. But, and this is a very important but, though, say, me as an artist, let's hypothesize a situation. Say I am an artist who is not who's conforming to whatever I'm doing. And in my mind is not any of these very important questions of life, even in my smaller circle. I just go sing or I just go paint. And the art I produce is therefore not directly resisting anything or asking difficult questions. But this is, I think, the greatness of the human mind. Built into every aesthetic structure of every art form is that window I spoke about in the beginning. So even if I don't, for example, have a direct intention, somehow in the process of making art, that window still appears in front of me. That window somehow opens. And maybe momentarily something happens, but I quickly run back to my security of society. So art, in a way, has a mechanism through which it offers you a gift. Art is a gift. Art is always telling you, you can see through that window if you want to. Even to the most, shall you say, conditioned and hardened mind, It is still providing that window. But we probably run there and run back. I remember a musician used to say that an artist should never show their emotions on stage. This is for singers. And I never understood why. He said, on stage, if you're moved, you should not tear up. You should not choke. And I think that is where the human being is refusing the gift of art. The artist himself is refusing the gift of art. That is to say, the window of resistance is open. Why don't you come and peek? And probably then go out and see what there is. Then there is the artist, like I said, himself or herself or theyself. Now, like I said, the artist may not have an overt agenda to change something, to question something. May not have. But then we have to see this with a little nuance. Because resistance does not mean there is always a target group or somebody out there that is being only pushed back. That could be one element of resistance. And I think who I would use as an example is Narayana Guru here. And I will also use the Vachanakaras of Karnataka. It's a very interesting, we do a lot of boxing things of them because we want to say one story and we use them for that story. But just think about this. What's fascinating about Guru for me is you could of course say he's a social reformer. He is of course pushed a casteless society. It was of course, and his social location meant he was directly fighting a caste battle. Let's just put it out there, right? But was he only doing that? This is where we need to think a little deeper. And what is fascinating is he was saying, I will fight for my right for faith. Very fascinating. And very similar to what the Vachanakaras did. My body, I have a right to the faith. And I have the right to say, this is how I will pray. This is how I will interpret. This is how I will experience. So it is not only about the other, but it was also fighting the interior of the self himself. So he was also fighting his own conditions. He was also fighting his own mindsets. Somewhere the outside and the inside collapses in this form of resistance. So it is a dialogue with somebody, but it's also a dialogue with oneself. It's also a dialogue to say, I will find reimagination to how I will believe, to how I will pray, to how I will surrender to whatever I believe in. And I think that's a fascinating way to look at resistance. Because if you only position resistance as an exterior mechanism, then what is happening to us during that resistance is something we don't investigate. And I think that Guru, in a very interesting manner, is playing this inward-outward game, if I can call it that. And they both spoke to each other very, very intensely, which is why he didn't see a dichotomy about singing about every god. At the same time, speak about social issues. There was no dichotomy there. He could sing about the goddess. He could sing about Shiva. He could sing about Christ. He could also question social action. He could finally say, I don't want any of these people's idols. This incredible fluidity in Guru is because resistance was not only I resist you movement, but was also what are we doing to ourselves in the process of resisting? What are we doing to those things within ourselves that also stop us from being able to push back our conditions? And I think that's fascinating. In the case of the Vachanakaras, I think there's also another nuance. Not everybody came from the same social position. Basava, for example, comes from caste privilege. Akkamahadevi comes from a different social location. And each of them, therefore, in fact, I've been working with some vachanas of late, and not too much, I'm no authority on it. But I find that the poetic expressions are very different even within that entire oeuvre or genre. And that's where this whole, their own locations and their own struggles and their own pushbacks are different discourses and different poetic discourses, and not are the same, because once again, it's both an inward and outward movement. But, I sing Carnatic music. So, you could ask, like, musicians who sing forms like, say, Carnatic music, isn't this word resistance an entirely moot word? I mean, you're calling me here to give this lecture very simply because you don't see me as a traditional Carnatic musician. Let's call it out here. You would not call a traditional Bhagavatar to come and give a lecture on art and cultural resistance. Because we are saying, what has this guy got to do with that? He comes, sings same kirtanas that have been sung for 200 years. He sings very well, oh, that's possible. So, it's very interesting. So, we are also, remember, labeling that person as almost a person who doesn't understand what modern discourse or democratic discourse is. So, we are doing something we should not be doing. Let's be very careful here. So, is there anything that exists in, shall we say, traditional, and I'll maybe further qualify, in privileged traditional art forms, right? The first point I want to make here is one, no artist ever performs or writes or sings anything they've learned exactly the way they've learned. Nobody does. That individual does something to what has been given. That we have to first recognize. So nobody is a parrot in that sense, right? I learned from a teacher or I'm guided by somebody, and then something about me starts speaking through what I do, right? That's one. Two, what about this idea of aesthetic resistance? Resistance that is within, shall we say, the aesthetic form of art itself. Is that also resistance? Because we are always talking about the socio-political, the obvious socio-political, right? What about aesthetic resistance? And I can tell you that there is a lot of aesthetic resistance. Let me give you my own example. Now, I started learning music when I was 12 years old, performing, and did what most people who wanted to become famous Carnatic musicians did, whatever that was. And the first thing that I actually started working deeply with was the form. So the first questions that emerged to me is, I sing a concert. Because after a point, you know your skill set, you know what to do. I can sing like that and make you applaud for the rest of my life. So I was asking myself, okay, this is pleasurable, but if it's so easy, what am I doing? And then I started researching about music, about its history, about its form, about all the grammar, everything. And the first changes that happened in the way I was an artist was in the way I sang the music, in the way I interpreted the music, in the way I performed a concert. There was nothing overtly socio-political about it. It is still within the community that practices this art form. But I was questioning raga, challenging tala, challenging formats of concerts. Where does this kind of resistance, what does it do? What is its social manifestations? Is it also asking social questions in a very subversive manner? Because it is. When I say that this cannot be the norm, I am also challenging the people who made it the norm. I am not saying it directly. But I'm saying that I don't believe this is the concept. I believe we've lost the heart and soul of this music by the way we've sung it. And I want to express myself. But I'm also saying, who stripped the heart and soul of this music? What has been stripped? What are we doing? So aesthetic resistance can happen even between the most, shall we say, crustacean art form. It happens. And so even the most, within quotes, conservative artists sometimes are doing that. And let's not underestimate its power. They may not sometimes even realize it. That's also a distinct possibility. So resistance can happen even in those contexts. Sometimes it could be even in linguistic liberties. I'll give you Tyagaraja's example. Now, I don't know what Tyagaraja thought when he did it. So, first you must know that Tyagaraja comes from what is known as the Mulakanadu Brahmin community that migrated southward post the Vijayanagara Empire collapse around that time. And they settled near in Tanjavur district. Now, in his compositions, interestingly, there is his language, Telugu, is of course his mother tongue, but he lived in Tamil speaking region. So in fact, even now if you go to Andhra Pradesh and sing Tyagaraja Kirtana, they'll still ask you to sing an Annamaya Kirtana. Because to them, poetic, real Telugu, pure Telugu is Annamacharya, not Tyagaraja, by the way. So there's a clear hierarchy there too. Now in his composition, in one of these compositions, he uses the word harami. Edutun lechite in Shankaravarnam. Harami tana melara bhakta Tyagaraja. Harami is obviously not a Telugu word. But it finds itself in a Tyagaraja Kirtana. In another Kirtana, he uses the word lantern. Now, I'm perceiving it. I'm not saying Tyagaraja do it. When I see harami in a Tyagaraja Kirtana, is it dialectically a kind of way of raising a question, resisting sense of purity? When you find the Tamil influence in his Telugu, is there some resistance to the notion of linguistic purity? Now, I cannot answer the question whether Tyagaraja thought of it this way. Of course, I can't. Maybe it was just poetic flow for him. Highly probable. But the fact, which also means that even the most conservative was having an interaction with the larger world, and that interaction seeps into their work of art, whether they intentionally want it or not. And that has a manifestation of asking important questions. So there is a nuance even when I look at the past and I think of somebody like, and I don't agree with many of the things Tyagaraja probably says. But this makes me think. And we have to think. And Tyagaraja doesn't stop with that, by the way. Even within his little world, it's most probably, it's also likely, according to some scholars, that in the pecking order of Brahmins in that region, he was probably in the lower level of the pecking order. Because he was a Telugu-speaking Brahmin who had migrated. So the Tamil-speaking Smartas of that belt were at the top of the pecking order, social order. So it's also possible that some of these things are coming from even that micro hierarchy that existed in his environment, right? But he does more things. In his compositions, there are times he directly challenges rituals. Manasunilpa Shakti Rekapote, he's saying, what are these people doing all these rituals? It's a waste of time. They have no control over their mind. All this is a waste. Then he talks about the falsities of devotees and the drama of being devotees. He goes on to say that, almost you could use the word pseudo-bhagavatas. He says that something like, they are like vessels that have milk, but vessels can never taste the milk. Now he is directly challenging Brahminical habits within his community. Now, that doesn't mean Tyagaraja is completely Catholic and he is understood the world and social hierarchies. No, of course not. There are things he says about other castes and he says about women that are deeply problematic to me. But here, can we as onlookers allow him that space to be both? Can we allow Tyagaraja to be, in our eyes, in certain spaces, problematic, but also say there is resistance there. Resistance is not an overarching arc that everybody embodies from every action of their life. We are also choosy about resistance. Let's be very honest about ourselves here. We are choosy. We decide what we want to resist. Other time we just close our ears and act as if it never happened. This is human behavior. So I think we have to allow that negotiation also there when we're looking at resistance in art and culture. That everybody is kind of negotiating, right or wrong. Just keep it aside for the moment. For the moment. We are negotiating that. We find places where we can find a middle ground. There are places where you cannot find a middle ground. Sometimes you just keep quiet. So everybody is doing that within their own life experience and what they know and what they don't know. There's another fascinating thing that happens. At times, a song or a piece of art, even a cultural movement at times, that is created in a certain context, gets shifted to a completely different context, meaning something else. And a classic example is the song Hum Dekhenge. It's a fascinating example of this. A song written in Pakistan, resisting Ziaul ul Haq, becomes the voice of the CAA protests across this country. Now, in the in-between period, it was mainly heard in the left circles to some extent. That's about it. Beyond which, it was not active as a song, right? So there's a dormancy of the song. Song goes dormant. It's not part of imagination. Then it completely comes back into being. Of course, there's what happened in Kanpur, etc., that gave it that context. But then, there are two resistances here. Now, I won't even call Faiz as original. No, this whole word original becomes very, very problematic. But Faiz writes it in a certain context. And his words embody that context and his emotional response to that context. That entire song and comes and, cradles itself in NRC-CAA movement. It suddenly becomes part of Indian Constitution almost. It's the voice of the Indian preamble. Wow. How did that happen? But then there's something else happening when this happens. What is the meaning of the song? Where does the meaning lie? The meaning moves. The meaning is re-understood. It's reimagined. People draw in a different manner. It's having resistances of different orders just because its context was shifted. Fascinating. I'm getting goosebumps as I say this. I find it fascinating. And how easily the people who sang it thought it was their song. In fact, I don't think Faiz actually became irrelevant at that point, if I may say so. It didn't matter who wrote it at that point. It became the voice of saying something more. So that too happens. That a song shifts in time, in context, and that is the beauty of art. And let me tell you that all great art has this inherent flexibility. When it actually can traverse and move among words and people and ideas and cultures and find new resonances and new conversations, the art object is being different things. It's not one object. It is so many objects. It's finding different locations and different people to find what I would call ethical beauty in it. But there can be other forms of resistance too. One could be that if an art form is closely held by one group and somebody from a different community or a different part starts practicing that art form. Now, classic case I will take Yesudas. It's a very interesting case. I'm not saying Yesudas should have necessarily thought. Yesudas did it because he loved the music. Simple. He loved Carnatic music. He learned Carnatic music. He sang Carnatic music. But the act of Yesudas becoming a Carnatic musician does something by just that act. Because his entry challenges status quo, challenges norms, and it becomes, and his presence is resistance. Fascinating. His presence is a resistance to something. His presence itself asks question. Seeing Yesudas, you ask the question, why are there many more Yesudases? You ask that question. Why? So sometimes the human being becomes actually just a conduit to the conversation, even if they don't intend to be that conduit. Even if they're not saying, I am doing it because I want to show these people that no, may not be, need not be, possibly. But the very existence happens. This also happens in today when there's a trans person dancing, a trans person singing. That, I've always wondered, we have these cliches in our head. I speak through the musical voice because that's how I hear the word world rather than see the world. And we have these cliches to how a woman's voice should be, how a man's voice should be. Those cliches are, of course, deeply troubling. Keeping that aside, what would happen if these forms are heard from various trance voices? What would the same raga sound like? Will the raga change its being? Will it get tonality it's never got before? Then you challenge the entire sonic ecosystem of what we are used to by the fact that there is Catholicity in terms of who is associating with the art form. And this can happen, by the way, on both sides of the stage, not just the performer. When the audience is of various social addresses, then the relationship is even more dynamic. Then the question happens, what about where you perform? Location, or where art and culture is being presented. You'll always find, and I found this in many schools, where they will say we have music class, and music class will be in one classroom. Folk arts will be outside. Now, nobody will answer the question to me and saying, why should folk arts be outside and music class in the classroom? They'll tell, no, we need space. That is, of course, not true. Nobody has bothered to think about that itself being a problematic structure, right? So now, if you invert location of where the art is performed, that itself, does it change something? If, say, art forms that are never heard on the street are heard on the street. If you hear raga alapanas in the middle of the street, in a bustling crowd, and I want to tell you my experience and how mindsets change. It's probably slightly diverging from the main thrust of my discussion today. But, so I've had the opportunity to sing on the streets, on the beach, in buses, in many locations. And in my previous avatar, before I even thought about any of these things, I was a stickler to an auditorium being silent. I used to get irritated if the flash click of the cameraman I could hear. And I was much younger, so I was ruder. But then, when I started singing in different locations, something changed. You're in a bus singing. Actually, nobody cares that you're singing. They probably think you're a hindrance. It's like, what is this stupid man coming in the bus? I want to go back home after my work. Why is he singing? And he's singing a song that I don't even understand. That makes things worse, right? And I'm singing there, absolutely vulnerable. For the first time in your life, a classical musician is vulnerable. Usually, classical musicians are not vulnerable. Because we know where we are performing, we know who you are, we know what you will do sabash for, what you will say ballet for. Now I'm in the beach, or I'm in the street, or I'm on the bus, and I am actually afraid. This is real fear. This is very interesting. This is real fear, because I was afraid that somebody is going to say, shut up. Okay? Now, but then, after you pass that, you kind of, once you start singing, you somehow cross that threshold. Then, magically, I was not bothered by the sound of the engine. I was not bothered by the chatter. And in some manner, the way I sang was responding to everything else that was going on there. They may not know, but there was a funny conversation between the tunes and the words and the engine and the road and everybody. Right? This pin drop silent was not needed for me there. So when the location changes, something also changes in the artist. The emotive nature changes. Your language of communication changes. Your sharing changes. So if you change the location, you do something to the art. You are questioning the art. You're questioning how the art is sung. You're questioning who's listening. So just shift of location sometimes can be an act of resistance. The inversion. Why shouldn't something like Parayatam be at a concert stage? The inversion is also a powerful resistance to what is presumed to be, within quotes, important, dignified, respectable, serious. All these words get challenged when you challenge location. There are some other interesting things that can happen. Even a docile piece of music at times becomes a form of resistance when the context of the world changes. I'll give you an example for this. Professor T M Krishna, the great violin artist, used to play at the Music Academy every year on 25th of December. That was his assigned date. He did it for years. We all knew when he played Jingle Bells, concert over. I mean, everybody knew this. Like, we all went, had fun, loved it. He would smile. He was a very affable person on stage. I mean, truly a jolly good man, as we'd say. And it was lovely. And nobody discussed Jingle Bells. Nobody thought anything. And then you have an environment where every action is seen in communal eyes. Right? Especially when this whole thing broke up saying Carnatic music you should only sing lyrics that are about Hindu gods. Now, the next year, I don't know what his political position was. Probably irrelevant. He was probably conservative. It's highly probable that he was on the conservative side of things. But he still played Jingle Bells, by the way. Because for him, he didn't see a problem in his head. That's very interesting. Now, after this entire thing explodes, he plays Jingle Bells in December. Now, suddenly, perceiver is seeing it differently. The perceiver is seeing two sides. Either they're saying, why is he playing Jingle Bells? It's a Christian song. Or other people saying, see, this is Indian culture. How fluid we are. Both are problematic positions to take. Because both are lies. We are not so easy people, by the way. But it's interesting. Suddenly, that piece of very docile artwork becomes a position of protest, or our perception of it. And in a funny way, we are appropriating it to our own resistance also. We are appropriating it, saying, look, this is a form in way we ask questions. So it's even these things. Or, when you sing in temples, and I've sung in temples in Kerala probably more than anybody in the last few generations in Carnatic music. I can pretty much claim that. And, you go to a temple, you almost know what not to sing. Nobody tells you, but you know. So when you go to a temple and you say, just change the content. Or if I go into a temple and I sing a very erotic padam, something, that erotic padam which is this piece of art, I'm just singing it. I'm not doing anything special to it. I am not proclaiming that, I'm not positioning it differently, aesthetic different, but just the fact that you sing it there becomes an act of resistance. Because you've given it a place which it didn't have before, at least in the recent past. Or even more accurately, if I have to say it, you are giving it the place that it always had, in which we stripped out of it when we completely disfranchised the Devadasi community from the aesthetics and art of what we today call Bharata or Carnatic music. So, leaving all this aside, what about creating artwork that is directly artworks of resistance? where I am consciously saying I am creating an artwork because today's environment is like this and I want to challenge this environment. And I've had the privilege and the pleasure of working with many people in creating musical pieces that have been born out of our observation of ourselves and society and where it is going, and saying, how do we respond to it, right? And this is harder than you think. People think you're an artist, you should be able to do this. It's harder because one of the things you have to remember as an artist is when you're creating a cultural being, the context can only be a trigger. The context can be the matchstick that gives you that direction of thought, that direction of feeling, that urge of saying, when all that we saw in Manipur, I was thinking to myself. And there was a song that we'd already created, which Perumal Murugan and I had created. And we were saying that, it is like a response to this. So, but then it can only be a trigger. We have to remember as artists that it cannot be entirely tied down into that trigger. It has to speak beyond that trigger. It has to speak to the larger issues in some manner, not necessarily in word. In music especially, it can be in tune. It can be in the way the music moves, that it gives you the larger expanse of the problem or the expanse of the emotive disaster that we are encountering. So it's very, very important that we do this. I'm saying this with as much acuteness as possible, because if you don't do this, the art does not excavate the interiority of our life experience or the interiority of what happened. It only talks of a superficial engagement of the event. Worse, there is no difference between an artwork and an advertisement. And I want to talk about this here because I find lot of political artwork deeply problematic. Now, because I think political art many times falls into this trap of being only literal. Only talking about that moment. Only talking about that event. Fine, it is necessary. It's a piece of propaganda, yes. But is it art? Is it much tougher question? We should ask that question. Because if it is constantly tied to that event, then it doesn't have the possibility of reappearing in so many different varieties, in so many different contexts, and so many different imaginations. The example that I always use is, I forget what the painting was called, which Picasso did after the Spanish conflict. Yeah, Guernica. That's a beautiful example of what I'm saying. It was directly responding to something that happened. But the painting stands to the idea that emerges from that happening. That's art. You don't need to know anything about Guernica to look at that painting and say, and be moved by what it is telling you. And we fall into this trap when we make both, interestingly, political art and religious art. Both do this, both fall into a very similar trap of remaining in that very literal position. Because then we are an advertisement to an idea, or we are a propaganda, which is fine as long as you call it out as that. It's not art. It is not hum dekhenge. Hum dekhenge is something else. So art can be used as a tool in this manner, but then it becomes a different body altogether. We, the so-called progressive and the liberals, also do something else. Coming from this side of, if I can say, this side perception of art, we also have a hierarchy of art, which we refuse to recognize. In our very proactive, activisty, political eyes, the highest position is art forms that are directly socio-politically challenging resistance. That to us is positioned here. As you come down the ladder, the most traditional will be at the bottom most of the ladder. So by the way, we are also playing a caste game here. It's just on the other inversion. Now here there is a subset, if I may be honest. Among the traditional art forms, there is a little complication. The complication is there are traditional art forms across communities. It's not only among the privileged caste communities, across genders. So within the traditional art forms, we create a different kind of a hierarchy. If it comes from marginalized communities, then it is given a different positioning. If it comes from a non-marginalized community, it's given a different positioning. Why I'm saying this is we have to recognize the way we perceive things. Again, it's not a judgment of right or wrong, but we also perceive in a vertical hierarchical structure. And we have to recognize that, because sometimes I think we lose out in engaging with earnestness, with seriousness, when we don't recognize that we also operate like every other human being. We are not special. So, I do have another 5 minutes? Okay. I think the most difficult questions that are in front of us, looking at the various ways in which culture and art and resistance operate, is, especially in today's context of this country, is how does one, in a way, marry our democratic beliefs, our deep belief in rights, equality, in liberty, along with the fact that our entire society, especially Indian society, has a varied sections of art forms and cultures in plural that are embedded in every practice which is undemocratic. Then I think that we have not grappled enough with this. And when I say art form, please remember it's a culture or cultures we are actually grappling with. It's not one art form. You're talking about a community or communities and social behaviors also. And I think that is kind of an unanswered question for us. We sometimes want them to behave in a manner that is in consonance with the way we perceive resistance, the way we, shall we say, express resistance. They have to express themselves in this manner. But what happens if the art just exists? If they're telling the same stories? If they're only practicing the same thing? Where is our connection with that? Where is their participation in this idea of resistance? Though there may be these multiple forms of resistance I spoke about. And here I'm talking about resistance in the framework of how we perceive our constitution and our democracy. One is, how are we going to, do we have a language, for example, to talk to those forms? And I'm not certain we have a language. I don't know whether I have a language. I don't know whether I have a language. I can speak for myself. Of how does one create a bridge in this? Can the art that they make itself be part of a larger discourse? Can that lead to change that is more organically happening within the system than being forced to be homogenized by a certain perception of how we see, within quotes, modernity, for example? Right? I think this is a very serious thought that we need to think about, because and I feel that we let go of that conversation, which is why among the various, shall we say, traditional cultures of this country, today you see a rise of great amount of bigotry of various forms. And that is because I don't think we developed a dialogue with the way those cultures behaved, with the way those cultures manifested themselves in art. We did not create enough of a dialogue. Maybe we did sometimes. Possibly I'm not overlooking certain endeavors. But in general, we did. So how does one speak? Muthu Chandran is a friend of ours. He does what is known as Tolpavai Kuttu. He lives near Nagarkoil. He's a wonderful artist. He also does some of his art for environmental requirements. Now, here we are purely using him. We are calling him and so just look at how we do this. Not that he doesn't want to do it, but just think of this a little dispassionately. I have an agenda to talk about environmental problem. So I call Muthu Chandran. Muthu Chandan is already a marginalized person who is waiting for opportunity for performance. And tell him, Muthu Chandan, I want you to make a drama for this cause. Now, is that an equal conversation between Muthu Chandran and me? It is not. And I'm talking about democracy. There is a roughage over here. There is something, I'm not saying we don't, of course he still comes, he loves to perform, he does it. You ask Muthu Chandran what he would like to perform, he'll say, I will do this part of Ramayana. But I don't want Ramayana. Why? Why don't I want Ramayana? Why can't I find a space for Ramayanam here? Muthu Chandanan's Ramayanam here. These are those little spaces of dialogues that I don't think we have yet emotively also figured out, intellectually apart. Because we have not figured out how we can give him that space to do what he loves. Maybe tomorrow he will do a different story. But can that be his own organic process? And not something I want to say. Right? So I think these unevennesses that exist within the idea of resistance and these inter and intra forms of resistance make cultural resistance a very complex space of operation. Make it much harder to navigate than we think. We ignore some resistances, we co-opt some resistances, we celebrate certain resistances. We sometimes only notice resistances if they are in X form. But resistance also constantly changes, constantly finds new voices. Our point is, how can we be open to all these different discourses? As much as there are cultures, there are resistances in the plural. And they have to talk to each other. And probably the only way you will find various discourses from the old and the new and the medieval and even futuristic, all possibly can coexist if we create an environment where there can be a dialogue across this, which means a society where people can honestly, at least to some degree, be recognized as people and not on the basis of their social address. Thank you very much.